Hi, I'm Rachel. I thought grieving my father meant saying goodbye with dignity, sharing memories, and healing together as a family. Instead, at his funeral, my sister Cassandra cornered me in the church bathroom and demanded half of my $890,000 inheritance while our father's body was still waiting to be lowered into the ground. I stayed silent, thinking she was just overwhelmed by grief. Then the lawyer spoke, and everything I thought I knew about my family shattered like glass. Because sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who never deserved your protection in the first place. The morning of October 15th started with that peculiar autumn chill that creeps through the windows of old houses, the kind that makes you pull your sweater tighter and wish you were anywhere else. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror in my small apartment in Millbrook, adjusting the black dress I'd bought just 2 days earlier. The fabric felt foreign against my skin, scratchy and unforgiving, like grief itself. Dad had been gone for 6 days. 6 days since the heart attack took him while he was reading the morning paper in his favorite armchair, coffee growing cold beside him. 6 days since I'd gotten the call from Aunt Lydia, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that the man who raised me single-handedly after Mom died was never coming home again. I grabbed my purse and the small leather journal I'd been carrying everywhere since the funeral home handed me Dad's personal effects. Inside were the last things he'd written, grocery lists mostly, but also a note that simply said, "Rachel, you were always my proudest achievement." I'd read it so many times the ink was starting to smudge from my fingertips. The drive to St. Matthew's Episcopal Church took me through the heart of Millbrook, past the diner where Dad and I used to share pancakes every Sunday morning, past the library where he taught me to love books, past the small insurance office where he'd worked for 37 years to make sure I never wanted for anything. Each familiar landmark felt like a goodbye I wasn't ready to say. The church parking lot was already half full when I arrived, and I recognized most of the cars. Dad's coworkers, neighbors from Elmwood Street where I'd grown up, members of the volunteer fire department where he'd served for 2 decades. These were the people who knew him as Charlie Brennan, the guy who'd shovel your driveway without being asked and who never missed a school play or soccer game, even when work ran late. I walked through the heavy oak doors of the church and was immediately hit by the smell of lilies and old wood polish. The sanctuary was bathed in colored light from the stained glass windows, casting everything in soft blues and golds that should have been comforting, but only made the casket at the front of the church look more real. More real. That's when I saw her. Cassandra stood near the front pew, wearing a black designer dress that probably cost more than my rent, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon that somehow managed to look both grieving and glamorous. She was surrounded by her usual entourage, her husband Derek hovering nearby in an expensive suit, their teenage twins looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes. My sister and I hadn't spoken in over a year, not since the fight about Dad's 70th birthday party. She'd wanted to throw something elaborate at the country club, all flash and no substance, while I'd suggested a quiet family dinner. The argument had escalated until she accused me of being jealous of her success, and I'd accused her of trying to buy Dad's affection. We both said things we couldn't take back. But seeing her there, in the place where we'd both been baptized, where Dad had walked her down the aisle 12 years ago, I felt that old familiar pull of family obligation. Maybe grief would bridge the gap between us. Maybe losing Dad would remind us that we only had each other now. I was wrong. The service was beautiful in the way that good funerals are, full of stories that made Dad sound like the hero he had always been to me. Pastor Williams talked about his quiet generosity, his devotion to his daughters, his unwavering faith even after losing his wife. I cried through most of it, the kind of ugly, honest tears that come when you're saying goodbye to the person who shaped your entire world. Cassandra spoke to, delivering a polished eulogy about family legacy and shared memories that sounded more like a speech she'd practiced than words from the heart. She talked about how Dad had always encouraged them to be strong, independent women, how he'd taught them the value of hard work and determination. All true, but somehow sterile, like she was talking about a character in a book rather than the man who used to make us grilled cheese sandwiches cut into star shapes when we were sick. After the service, as people filed out toward the cemetery, I ducked into the ladies' room to splash cold water on my face and try to repair the mascara damage. I was alone for maybe 30 seconds before the door swung open and Cassandra walked in, her heels clicking against the tile floor with purpose.
"Rachel," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "We need to talk." I turned to face her, seeing my own red-rimmed eyes reflected in the mirror behind her head. "Not here, Cass. Not today. Especially today," she said, stepping closer. Her perfume was overwhelming in the small space, something expensive and cloying that made my stomach turn. "Look, I know we haven't been getting along, but Dad's gone now. We're all each other has left." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was our chance to rebuild what we'd lost. "I've been thinking about the inheritance," she continued, and my heart sank. "I know Dad left everything to you in the will, but that doesn't seem fair, does it? I mean, we're both his daughters. We both loved him." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Cassandra, he's not even in the ground yet." I know, it seems cold, but Derek's practice is struggling, and the twins will need college money soon. Dad's estate is worth almost $900,000 between the house, the life insurance, and his retirement accounts. Surely you can see that splitting it would be the right thing to do? The bathroom suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around us. "He made his will the way he wanted it, Cass. If he'd wanted to split everything, he would have." Her face hardened, the grief mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "You always were his favorite, little Rachel, who never left town, who visited every Sunday, who played the perfect daughter while I was out building a real life." "I never asked to be anyone's favorite," I said quietly. "I just loved him." "Well, love doesn't pay for private school tuition or keep a medical practice afloat," she snapped. "I'm not asking for charity, Rachel. I'm asking for what's fair. Half of everything. It's what any reasonable person would do." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. The girl who used to braid my hair and sneak me cookies before dinner had been replaced by someone calculating and cold, someone who could stand in a church bathroom on the day of our father's funeral and reduce his love to a dollar amount. "I can't do this right now," I said, moving toward the door. "We can talk about this later, after what? After you've had time to think of excuses?" She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "I want an answer, Rachel, today. Half or I'll contest the will. Derek knows lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing." I pulled my arm free and stared at her for a long moment. The church bells were ringing outside, calling us to the cemetery, calling us to say our final goodbye to the man who'd given us everything and asked for nothing but love in return. "We'll see," I said finally, and walked out of the bathroom without looking back. But as I followed the procession of cars toward Millbrook Cemetery, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, I realized that whatever happened next, the sister that I'd grown up with was as dead and buried as the father we were about to lay to rest. The real question was what Cassandra would do when she discovered that Dad's will contained more than just money, much more, and what I would do when the truth finally came to light. If you're loving what you're hearing, smash that subscribe button. It really keeps us going. All right, let's jump back in. The graveside service felt like watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. I stood there as Pastor Williams spoke about dust returning to dust, watching the polished mahogany casket that held my father, while my sister's words echoed in my head like a broken record. Half of everything. It's what any reasonable person would do. The October wind whipped through the cemetery, sending fallen leaves skittering across the headstones like restless spirits. I pulled my coat tighter and tried to focus on the pastor's words about eternal rest and God's grace. But all I could think about was the look in Cassandra's eyes in that bathroom. Cold, calculating, like she was negotiating a business deal instead of talking about our father's legacy.
After the cemetery, people gathered at Dad's house on Elmwood Street for the traditional post-funeral meal, the same house where Cassandra and I had grown up, where Dad had taught us to ride bikes in the driveway and helped us with homework at the kitchen table. Now it felt like a museum of memories that my sister was already calculating the square footage on. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, accepting condolences and listening to stories about Dad's kindness, his work ethic, his devotion to his daughters. Mrs. Patterson from next door grabbed my hand with her weathered fingers and said, "Your father was so proud of you, honey, always talking about how you looked after him, how you never forgot where you came from."
The words should have been comforting, but they only made the knot in my stomach tighten, because I was starting to remember things I'd pushed aside for years, patterns I've ignored because it was easier than facing the truth about my sister. Like the time 3 years ago when Dad had pneumonia and was in the hospital for a week. I'd taken vacation days to stay with him, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, making sure he ate, advocating with doctors and nurses. Cassandra had visited once, for maybe 20 minutes, and spent most of that time on her phone dealing with what she called urgent business matters. Or the time Dad fell off the ladder while cleaning gutters and sprained his ankle. I'd driven over immediately, helped him to the emergency room, and then spent the next 2 weeks grocery shopping for him and making sure he took his medication. Cassandra had sent a get-well card. When Dad's arthritis got so bad he couldn't manage the yard work anymore, I'd started coming over every weekend with my lawnmower. When his eyesight began failing and he was too proud to admit he shouldn't be driving at night, I became his personal chauffeur to doctor's appointments and grocery stores. When he'd finally admitted he was lonely, rattling around in that big house by himself, I'd started having dinner with him twice a week. Cassandra lived 45 minutes away in the upscale suburb of Ridgemont. She had a busy life, she always said, important responsibilities, a medical practice to help run, charity galas to attend, children's activities to coordinate. She'd visit on major holidays and Dad's birthday, swooping in with expensive gifts and stories about her successful life, then disappearing again until the calendar demanded another appearance. But Dad never complained. Never said a word about the unequal distribution of attention or effort. He'd just smile when I mentioned Cassandra's latest excuse for missing Sunday dinner and say, "She's building something important, Rachel. We should be proud of her success." I was proud. Or I thought I was. It wasn't until I stood in his living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, that I realized how one-sided our family dynamic had become. The bookshelf was full of photos. Dad and me at my college graduation, Dad and me at the volunteer fighter department's annual barbecue, Dad and me painting the back fence last spring. There were pictures of Cassandra too, but they were older. Her wedding day 12 years ago, a family portrait from the twins' christening. Nothing recent. Nothing that showed her as part of Dad's daily life, rather than just a visitor passing through. Derek found me staring at the photos, a plate of untouched casserole in my hands. "Rachel," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "Cassandra wanted me to talk to you about the inheritance situation." I turned to look at him, this man I'd known for over a decade, but somehow never really understood. Derek was handsome in that bland country club way, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was a plastic surgeon, which Cassandra never failed to mention when introducing him, as if his ability to reshape faces somehow elevated their entire family's status. "She's upset," he continued, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "This whole thing with the will, it's just not fair. You have to understand, we've got significant expenses. The practice, the kids' private school, the mortgage on the house. We were counting on Charlie's estate to help secure the twins' college funds." "You were counting on it?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Dad never promised you anything, Derek." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Come on, Rachel. You live in a one-bedroom apartment and work at the library. What are you going to do with $890,000? Cassandra and we could actually put that money to good use. Investment opportunities, real estate, the kids' education. We're talking about building something lasting here." I stared at him, feeling like I was seeing him clearly for the first time. "You mean you're talking about spending it?"
"That's not fair," he said, but his tone had shifted from diplomatic to defensive. "We're talking about responsible financial planning. Cassandra deserves her share of her father's estate. Any court would see that. Any court would see that Dad made his wishes clear in a legal document," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. If he'd wanted to split everything equally, he would have. His jaw slipped a little further. "You think because you played the devoted daughter, staying in this nowhere town, never getting married, never building a real life, that somehow makes you more deserving? Cassandra made something of herself. She married well, had children, contributed to society. She shouldn't be punished for success." The words hit like physical blows. Never getting married, never building a real life. As if love and loyalty and showing up day after day counted for nothing. As if my choices to stay close to Dad, to prioritize family over career advancement, to find fulfillment in simple things like Sunday dinners and weekend yard work made me less than.
I looked around the room at the people who had come to honor my father's memory. These weren't high society types or business leaders or anyone particularly important by Derek and Cassandra's standards. They were ordinary people who had loved an ordinary man who had lived an extraordinary life by being consistently kind, generous, and present. Mrs. Patterson was telling a story about how Dad had shoveled her driveway every winter for 15 years without being asked. Jimmy Rodriguez from the fire department was laughing about the time Dad had organized a fundraiser for a local family whose house had burned down. These people weren't here because Dad had been wealthy or successful in any conventional sense. They were here because he had made their lives better simply by being in them. "I need some air," I told Derek and walked out to the back porch before he could respond. The yard looked exactly the way I'd left it the weekend before Dad died. Autumn leaves raked into neat piles, the flower beds mulched and ready for winter, the bird feeders full. I'd been taking care of this place like it was my own for years, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because it was home, because Dad was here. Now Cassandra wanted to turn it into a real estate transaction. I sat down on the porch swing Dad had built when I was 12, the same swing where he'd taught me to read stock reports when I was in high school, where we'd sat and talked about everything and nothing on countless summer evenings. The chains creaked softly in the wind, and for a moment I could almost pretend he was still inside, probably making coffee and getting ready to join me with some story about his day. My phone buzzed. A text from Cassandra. "We need to settle this tonight. Derek spoke to you. I hope you'll do the right thing." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The years of showing up, of being present, of putting Dad's needs before my own convenience. The birthdays and holidays when Cassandra had last-minute excuses. The emergency room visits when I was the only one who came. The quiet conversations about Dad's fears and dreams and hopes for our future. She wanted half of his estate. She could have it. But first, she was going to learn exactly what that estate contained. Because there were things about Dad's will that Cassandra didn't know yet. Things that would change everything. And tomorrow, when we met with Dad's lawyer for the official reading, the real story was going to come out. The story of a father who had seen more clearly than either of his daughters realized, and who had made provisions that would reveal the true cost of love, loyalty, and showing up when it mattered most. I stood up from the swing and walked back inside, past Derek's calculating stare and Cassandra's expectant smile, and began saying my goodbyes to the people who had really known my father. Because tomorrow was going to change everything, and I wanted one last night to remember the way things used to be, before my sister discovered that some inheritances come with prices she might not be willing to pay. The law offices of Hartwell and Associates sat on the corner of Main and 3rd Street in downtown Millbrook, occupying the second floor of a red brick building that probably looked elegant in the 1920s, but now looked tired around the edges. I climbed the narrow staircase at exactly 2 p.m., my heels echoing against the worn wooden steps, carrying the leather portfolio that contained everything I thought I knew about my father's final wishes. Cassandra was already there when I arrived, sitting in the small waiting area with Derek beside her, both of them looking like they were attending a board meeting rather than the reading of our father's will. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, her hair pulled back in that severe style she favored for important occasions. Derek checked his Rolex twice in the 30 seconds it took me to hang up my coat. "Rachel," Cassandra said, standing to greet me with the kind of air kiss that never actually makes contact. "I'm so glad you're here. I was worried you might try to avoid this conversation." "Why would I avoid it?" I asked, settling into the chair across from them. "Dad's will is Dad's will." "Well, that's exactly what we need to discuss," Derek interjected, leaning forward with his practiced smile. "Wills can be interpreted in different ways, and sometimes the most loving thing to do is to honor the spirit of what someone wanted rather than getting caught up in legal technicalities." I stared at him, wondering how someone could sound so reasonable while saying something so fundamentally dishonest. "You mean honor what you think he should have wanted?" Before Derek could respond, the inner office door opened and Thomas Hartwell emerged. Dad's lawyer was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town attorney who'd been practicing for 40 years. A rumpled gray suit, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of patient demeanor that came from dealing with grieving families for decades.
"Miss Brennan, Mrs. Montgomery," he said, nodding to each of us in turn. "Please, come in. I know this is a difficult time, but we have some important matters to discuss." His office was all dark wood and leather-bound books, with diplomas and certificates covering one wall, and family photos scattered across his desk. He gestured for us to sit in the chairs arranged in front of his desk, then settled himself behind it with a thick manila folder. "First, let me say how sorry I am for your loss," he began, his voice gentle but professional. "Your father was a good man, and I was honored to call him a friend as well as a client." Cassandra shifted impatiently in her chair. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. We appreciate that. But we're hoping we can expedite this process somewhat. There are some family matters we need to resolve, and we're hoping you can help us understand our options regarding the estate distribution." Mr. Hartwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, Mrs. Montgomery, your father's wishes were quite specific. But before we get to the formal reading, I should mention that your father asked me to show you something." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder. "He made this recording about 6 months ago, after his last heart episode. He wanted you both to hear it before we discussed the legal documents." My stomach dropped. 6 months ago, Dad had spent 3 days in the hospital after what the doctors called a cardiac event. Nothing serious, they'd said, just a warning to take things easier. I'd stayed with him, of course, sleeping in the hospital chair and making sure he followed the doctor's orders when he came home. Cassandra had sent flowers. Mr. Hartwell pressed play, and suddenly Dad's voice filled the room, warm and familiar, and so achingly present that I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from breaking down. "Tom, I hope my girls never have to hear this, but if they do, it means I'm gone, and they're probably sitting in your office wondering why I did what I did." There was a pause, the sound of Dad clearing his throat. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, especially since the heart scare. And I want them to understand that every decision I made was made with love, even if it doesn't feel that way at first." Cassandra's face had gone pale, but her jaw was set in that stubborn line I remembered from childhood arguments. "Rachel, honey, I know this inheritance might feel like a burden, but you've already been carrying the load for years. You've given up so much to make sure I wasn't alone, to make sure I felt loved and cared for in my final years. You never asked for anything in return, never made me feel like an obligation. That kind of love is rare, sweetheart, and it deserves to be honored." I could feel tears starting, but I blinked them back, not wanting to break down in front of Cassandra and Derek. "And Cassandra, I love you just as much,
But love isn't always about what we give our children. Sometimes it's about what we teach them. You built a beautiful life, baby girl, but somewhere along the way you forgot that success isn't just about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute to the people who matter most. Cassandra's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her suit. I'm not punishing you, Cassie. I'm trying to give you something more valuable than money. I'm giving you a chance to choose what kind of person you want to be going forward. Whether you want to be someone who demands what she thinks she deserves, or someone who earns what she receives through love and service to others. The recording crackled with static for a moment, then Dad's voice returned, stronger now. Tom, I've left specific instructions about how I want my estate handled. Rachel gets the house, the savings, and the life insurance because she's already proven she understands what family really means. But I've also established something else, something that I hope will bring my daughters back together instead of driving them apart. Mr. Hartwell stopped the recording and looked at both of us carefully. Your father was very concerned about the relationship between you two. He felt that grief and money had the potential to destroy what was left of your connection. So he created what he called a reconciliation clause in his will. What does that mean? Derek demanded, his diplomatic mask finally slipping. Mr. Hartwell opened the folder and pulled out several documents. It means that while Rachel is indeed the primary beneficiary of the estate, your father also established a trust fund worth $200,000 specifically for Cassandra's children's education. However, there are conditions. Cassandra leaned forward. What kind of conditions? The trust can only be accessed if both sisters agree to it and unanimously, and it can only be used for education expenses that both sisters approve of. Your father wanted to ensure that his grandchildren would benefit from his legacy, but only if his daughters could find a way to work together. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the bookshelf. I could see the calculations happening behind Cassandra's eyes. The shift from demands for half of everything to the realization that cooperation was now required.
There's more, Mr. Hartwell continued. Your father also established a charitable foundation in your family's name, seeded with $100,000 from the estate. The foundation's mission is to provide support for elderly residents of Millbrook who need assistance with home maintenance and care. He wanted his legacy to continue the work he'd been doing informally for years. And let me guess, Derek said, his voice tight with frustration, that also requires both daughters to agree? The foundation requires both daughters to serve on the board and to agree on all funding decisions, Mr. Hartwell confirmed. Your father felt very strongly that his money should be used to help people, not just to accumulate more wealth. I stared at the documents, seeing Dad's wisdom in every carefully crafted clause. He hadn't just left me money. He'd left me tools. Tools to help our community, tools to secure his grandchildren's future, and most importantly, tools to discover whether my sister was capable of growth, of putting others before herself, of choosing connection over control. This is ridiculous, Cassandra snapped, her composure finally cracking. He's trying to manipulate us from the grave, making us jump through hoops for money that should be ours by right. The money is yours by right, I said, quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the office. Your children's education fund is yours. The foundation work is ours. But Dad knew something about us that we've been pretending not to see. And what's that? She demanded. That we haven't been sisters for a long time. We've been strangers who happen to share DNA. He's giving us a chance to change that, if we want to. Derek stood up abruptly. This is emotional manipulation, pure and simple. We'll contest this. No court is going to uphold conditions like these. Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat gently. Actually, Mr. Montgomery, your father anticipated that reaction. He had this will reviewed by 3 different estate attorneys, and every clause has been carefully structured to be legally bulletproof. Contest it if you wish, but you'll likely spend more in legal fees than the trust is worth, and you'll lose access to everything if you lose the case." Cassandra looked trapped, her eyes darting between Derek and me and the lawyer. "So what are you saying? That I have to beg Rachel for permission to access money for my own children's education?" "I'm saying you have to remember how to be my sister," I replied, standing up and gathering my purse. "Dad never asked you to beg for anything. He asked you to participate, to show up, to care about something other than your own convenience." I turned to Mr. Hartwell. "I'll need copies of all the documents, and I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the foundation structure. As for the Children's Trust, I'm happy to discuss it when Cassandra is ready to have a conversation about what's best for the twins rather than what's most profitable for her household." "Rachel, wait," Cassandra called as I headed for the door. "You can't just walk away from this." I turned back to look at her, this woman who shared my eyes and my father's stubborn shin, but who had somehow become a stranger. "I'm not walking away, Cass. I'm walking towards something Dad would be proud of. The question is whether you're coming with me or not." As I left the office and walked down those creaky stairs, I realized that Dad had given me something more valuable than money or property. He'd given me the power to choose my own family, to decide what relationships were worth preserving and which ones were just obligations disguised as love. For the first time since his death, I felt like I knew exactly what I would want me to do next. And whether Cassandra chose to join me or fight me, I was finally ready to honor the man who had taught me that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the love you gave and the lives you touched along the way. The first call came at 6:47 a.m., 3 days after the will reading. I was standing in Dad's kitchen, sorting through decades of accumulated memories while the coffee brewed, when my phone erupted with Cassandra's ringtone. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came 2 minutes later, then the third. By the time I finally answered on the fourth attempt, I could hear the barely controlled hysteria in her voice. "Rachel, we need to talk right now. This whole foundation thing, these ridiculous conditions Dad put in place, they're not going to work. Derek's been researching the legal implications, and we think there might be grounds to challenge the entire structure." I walked to the window and looked out at the bird feeders Dad had meticulously maintained, now empty and waiting for me to continue his ritual. "Good morning to you too, Cass." "Don't be sarcastic with me. This is serious. Do you have any idea what private school tuition costs these days? What it takes to maintain a medical practice? We have real financial obligations, Rachel, not just sentimental attachments to old houses and small-town charity work." "I'm aware of what things cost," I said quietly. "I've been managing Dad's finances for the past 5 years, remember? Including the $2,000 he sent you last Christmas when Derek's practice had that temporary cash flow problem." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Cassandra finally spoke, her voice was different, sharper. "I've been keeping track because someone had to. Dad never wanted you to know how often he worried about money, how many corners he cut to make sure he could help you when you called. He sold his truck and started taking the bus to work because he didn't want to tell you he couldn't afford the car payment after he paid for Emma's orthodontics." Another silence. Then, "That's not my fault. He never told me he was struggling. If he had just said something." "When, Cassandra? During your 5-minute phone calls every few weeks? During your annual Christmas visit when you spent the whole time talking about your vacation plans and Derek's latest golf tournament wins? You're being cruel." "I'm being honest. There's a difference." That afternoon, Derek showed up at Dad's house unannounced, finding me in the garage where I was sorting through boxes of Dad's volunteer fire department memorabilia. He'd traded his usual business attire for jeans and a sweater, probably hoping to appear more approachable, but his practiced smile was still firmly in place. "Rachel, I was hoping we could have a rational conversation about this situation, adult to adult, without all the emotional baggage." I continued wrapping newspaper around Dad's collection of fire department patches, each one representing a year of service, a life saved, a family helped. "What situation would that be, Derek?" "This trust fund business. Look, I understand you're grieving, and grief can make people act in ways that would have broken our loved one's heart. But my father worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. But now his wishes are being twisted to serve one person's need for control and revenge. I set down the box and turned to face him fully. Your children's future was secured the moment Dad put $200,000 in trust for their education. The only thing being held hostage is your ability to control how that money gets spent. Control? Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. You call wanting to make decisions about my own children's education control? You don't have kids, Rachel. You don't understand the pressure, the responsibility. You're right. I don't have children, but I spent the last decade watching Dad put aside money for those kids while you bought new cars and took European vacations. He saved for their college funds while eating generic cereal and clipping coupons. So forgive me if I think he earned the right to have a say in how his money gets used. Derek's mask slipped a little further. That's his choice, not mine. I never asked him to sacrifice anything for us. No, you just accepted it. Year after year, check after check, never once asking if he could afford it or if he needed anything in return. That's what grandparents do. Derek snapped. They help family. They don't attach strings and conditions and make people jump through hoops for money that should flow naturally between generations. I stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how he viewed our family, not as people who loved each other, but as a financial resource to be managed and maximized. Dad wasn't a grandfather to him. He was a trust fund with a heartbeat. Get out, I said quietly. Rachel, let's be reasonable. Get out of my father's house, now. He left, but not before informing me that they'd consulted with an estate attorney in the city, someone who specialized in challenging unconventional will provisions, someone who thought they might have grounds to argue that Dad wasn't of sound mind when he created the foundation requirements. That night, I called Mr. Hartwell and told him about Derek's threats. His response was calm but firm. Rachel, your father anticipated this reaction. That's why he had multiple psychological evaluations done when he updated his will. 3 different doctors confirmed his mental competency. Any challenge based on diminished capacity would fail quickly and expensively. So they can't break the will? They can try, but they'd be fighting a losing battle. More importantly, any attempt to contest the will would void their access to the children's trust entirely. Your father was very specific about that clause. The escalation came 2 weeks later in the form of a Facebook post that Cassandra shared publicly, tagged with half the population of Millbrook. Sometimes grief makes people act in ways that would have broken our loved one's heart. My father worked hard his entire life to provide for his family, but now his wishes are being twisted to serve one person's need for control and revenge. I'm asking for prayers as we navigate this difficult situation and try to honor Dad's true intentions despite the legal obstacles we're facing. Family should come first, always.
Other comments followed. People sharing memories of Dad's volunteer work, his quiet generosity, his pride in both his daughters, but his worry about their relationship. Jimmy Rodriguez from the fire department posted a long comment about Dad's vision for the foundation, conversations they'd had about helping elderly residents who couldn't afford home repairs. The narrative Cassandra had tried to create began crumbling as the real story emerged. The story of a man who had loved both his daughters, but who had seen clearly which one understood the value of service over self-interest. 3 days after the Facebook post, Cassandra called again. This time, she was crying. Rachel, please, this has gotten out of hand. People are looking at me like I'm some kind of monster. Derek's patients are asking questions. The kids are hearing things at school. What kinds of things? That we're greedy, that we didn't take care of Dad, that we're trying to steal money from charity. Her voice broke. Emma asked me yesterday if it was true that we only visited Grandpa when we wanted something. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of Dad's wisdom settling around me like a blanket. He'd known this would happen.
He'd known that the truth would surface, that the community that had watched our family for decades would eventually speak up. What did you tell her? I didn't know what to say, because maybe it wasn't entirely wrong. For the first time since Dad's death, I heard something real in my sister's voice. Not calculation or manipulation or the polished performance she'd perfected over the years, just honest, painful recognition. Cass, Dad didn't create those conditions to punish you. He created them because he believed you could still choose to be the person he raised you to be. The sister I grew up with, the daughter who used to help him bake cookies for the fire department fundraisers. I don't know how to be that person anymore, she whispered. I don't know when I stopped being her. Maybe that's where we start, I said. Maybe instead of fighting Dad's will, we try to understand what he was really asking of us. The foundation board meeting is next week. If I actually showed up and tried to participate, would you consider releasing some of the education fund early? Emma needs her tuition payment by the end of the month. Come to the meeting. Not because of the money, but because Dad believed we could still be sisters. Let's see if he was right. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Dad's final gift wasn't the inheritance or the house or even the foundation. It was this moment, this choice, this chance for all of us to discover whether love and loss could teach us something that success and comfort never had. Whether we could choose family over finance, connection over control, and healing over the hurts that had driven us apart. The real test was just beginning. The first Brennan Family Foundation Board meeting was held in the small conference room at the Millbrook Community Center, the same building where Dad had volunteered for countless pancake breakfasts and blood drives over the years. I arrived early, arranging folders and bottled water around the worn wooden table, my hands steady despite the uncertainty churning in my stomach. Cassandra walked in at exactly 2 p.m., dressed in simple black slacks and a white blouse instead of her usual designer armor. She looked smaller somehow, more like the sister I remembered from childhood than the polished stranger she had become. Behind her trailed Derek, but she held up a hand before he could enter the room. This is between Rachel and me, like it should have been from the beginning. Derek's face flushed red. Cassandra, we discussed this. You can't make financial decisions this important without consulting... Without consulting what? My husband? My accountant? My lawyer? She turned to face him fully. When's the last time I made a decision because it was right, instead of because it was profitable? He stared at her for a moment, clearly recognizing this wasn't the same woman who had left the house that morning. You're making a mistake, he said finally. This emotional guilt trip your father orchestrated from beyond the grave is exactly what I warned you about. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. My judgment was clouded, just not the way you think. After Derek left, Cassandra sat down across from me at the table where Dad had envisioned his daughters working together to help their community. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I found something, she said finally, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small leather notebook. I was going through Mom's jewelry box, looking for something to sell to help with Emma's tuition, and I found this tucked behind the velvet lining. She slid the notebook across the table. It was Dad's handwriting, entries dated over the past 3 years. I opened it carefully, recognizing his careful script immediately. June 15th. Called Cassandra to see how the kids were doing. She was rushing to a dinner party, said she'd call back. She didn't. September 3rd. Rachel came over to help with the gutters, spent the whole afternoon, wouldn't let me pay her, made her favorite chicken parmesan for dinner. These moments are what I'll miss most.
December 20th. Sent Cassandra money for Emma's school trip. She texted thanks, but didn't call. Wonder if she knows how much I just want to hear her voice. Page after page of entries, documenting the loneliness of a man who had given everything to his daughters and received vastly different amounts in return. But there was no bitterness in his words, just a quiet sadness and an endless hope that things might change. Cassandra's hands were shaking as I read. I never knew, she whispered. I thought he was fine.
I thought he was proud of my success, proud that I didn't need him anymore. He was proud of your success, I said softly, but he needed you to need him too, not his money. Him. The entry dated just 2 weeks before his death made us both cry. Cassandra called today to ask about the inheritance, wanting to know if I'd updated my will recently. Didn't ask about my health or if I was lonely. I told her I loved her. She said, "Love you too, Dad," like she was reading from a script. Rachel brought soup tonight because she noticed I was coughing. Sometimes I wonder if Cassandra would notice if I just disappeared. "I killed him," Cassandra said, tears streaming down her face. "All those years of taking and never giving back, of treating him like an ATM instead of a father. I killed his spirit long before his heart gave out." "No," I said firmly, "you disappointed him. You hurt him. But you didn't kill him. And he still believed you could change right up until the end. That's why he created this foundation. That's why he put those conditions in place." We spent the next hour going through the foundation's proposed mission statement, Dad's notes about which community members needed help most urgently, his dreams of creating something that would outlast his own life. Mrs. Patterson needed new steps built. The Hendersons couldn't afford to have their furnace repaired before winter. Mr. Chen from the grocery store wanted to help, but his arthritis made yard work impossible. Dad had a list of every elderly person in town who might need assistance, I told Cassandra. He'd been quietly helping people for years, but he wanted something more organized, more sustainable. "How much would it cost to help everyone on this list?" she asked, studying the pages of careful notes. "About $30,000 for the immediate needs. The ongoing programs would need maybe $50,000 a year to really make a difference." Cassandra was quiet for a long time, staring at the notebook. "Derek's going to divorce me," she said finally. "What? If I choose this foundation over fighting for more inheritance money, if I choose working with you over maximizing our return, he'll leave. He's already threatened it. Says I'm having an emotional breakdown and need to think about our family's financial security." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Maybe your family's security isn't just about money. The twins' tuition is due next month. If I don't contest the will, if I don't fight for a bigger share, I don't know how we'll manage the payments. Cass, there's $200,000 in that education trust. Even if we only release a portion of it now, it's more than enough for both kids' tuition for years." "But Derek says we should be getting more. He says Dad's favoritism toward you was unfair, that any reasonable court would see that. What do you say?" She looked down at the notebook, at Dad's careful documentation of 3 years of one-sided love. "I say I spent so long trying to prove I didn't need him that I forgot to show him I wanted him." Over the next 2 hours, we planned the foundation's first initiatives. We allocated funds for Mrs. Patterson's steps, the Hendersons' furnace, and a new lawnmower that could be loaned to families who couldn't afford yard work. We discussed partnering with the fire department for safety inspections and with the library for a senior services resource center. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I was honoring his memory instead of just managing his affairs. "I want to release $40,000 from the Children's Trust," I told Cassandra as we prepared to leave. "That covers both kids' tuition for this year and next, plus some emergency funds for unexpected expenses." "Just like that? No more conditions or hoops to jump through?" "Just like that." Dad wanted his grandchildren to have opportunities, but he also wanted them to have a mother who understood the difference between success and significance. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. "What if Derek still leaves? What if choosing this family over his version of financial security costs me my marriage?" "Then you'll know which kind of love is worth keeping, and you'll know that you'll never be alone as long as you have a sister who finally got her big sister back."
3 months later, the foundation had helped 17 families and received donations from 12 local businesses who wanted to support Dad's vision. Cassandra came to every board meeting, often bringing Emma and Ethan to help with smaller projects. She and Derek were in counseling, trying to rebuild a marriage that had been built more on mutual advantage than on mutual respect.
I moved into Dad's house not because I needed the space, but because it felt like home in a way my apartment never had. I kept his bird feeders full and his garden maintained, and every Sunday I made the chicken parmesan he'd loved so much, even though I was eating it alone. But I wasn't really alone. Cassandra called twice a week now, not because she needed anything, but because she wanted to talk. About the kids, about her struggles with Derek, about the foundation, about memories of Dad that felt sacred instead of painful. On what would have been Dad's 73rd birthday, we met at his grave with flowers and coffee and his favorite thermos. We told him about Mrs. Patterson's new steps and how grateful she'd been, about the Hendersons' warm house and how they'd invited us for dinner to say thank you, about Emma's straight A's and Ethan's soccer team making the playoffs. "Do you think he knows?" Cassandra asked, arranging daisies around the headstone. "Do you think he can see what we're building?" I thought about the notebook entries, about a man who had never stopped believing his daughters could find their way back to each other, about trust funds with conditions and foundations with purpose, and the kind of love that guides people even after death. "I think he always knew," I said. "I think he was just waiting for us to figure it out ourselves." As we walked back to our cars, Cassandra linked her arm through mine the way she used to when we were children walking home from school. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for all the years I wasn't the sister you deserved, for treating Dad's love like a given instead of a gift, for almost letting Derek's greed destroy what Dad spent his whole life building." "We're here now," I said. "That's what matters. We're finally here." The Brennan Family Foundation is still operating 5 years later, having helped over 200 families in Millbrook and the surrounding counties. Both of Dad's granddaughters volunteer regularly, understanding in a way their mother had to relearn that wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. And sometimes, when I'm working in Dad's garden or sitting on his porch swing in the evening, I swear I can hear his voice in the wind, saying the words he never got tired of telling us. Family isn't about blood or money or obligation. It's about showing up for each other, especially when it's hard. He was right, as usual. And it only took losing him to learn how to really find each other. If you've ever had to choose between what people expect of you and what you know is right, you understand the weight of that decision. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the wisdom to recognize what really matters before it's too late. Have you ever discovered that the people who challenge you the most are actually offering you the greatest gifts? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this reminded you that family is something you choose every day, not just something you're born into, please subscribe for more stories about finding your way home to the people who matter most. Because sometimes the most valuable things we inherit can't be deposited in a bank account, but they can change everything about the way we choose to live. Next up, 2 more stories chosen just for you. If you enjoyed this, you'll want to see what's coming. Tap to keep going.